Phillip. So in this video, we're going to talk about synthesizing research sources. Now, this is an important part of what we do as critical thinkers, as writers, as scholars. Basically, when you're synthesizing sources, you are identifying convergences between them. You're identifying ways in which different research sources talk about the same issues, talk about particular points that you have an interest in or that you want to address in your essay. And essentially with synthesis, what you're looking at is connections and divergences between those sources. So if you're doing a research project and you want to discuss topic A, whatever topic A is, you have three sources. Your first source says one thing about topic A, your second source says a different thing about topic A, and your third source agrees with the first source. Now you can synthesize all of this information by taking the two sources that agree with one another and saying, here's some evidence for this answer to the question, but you also want to consider source 2, which says, actually, here's a different answer. And so this is essentially what synthesis is all about, is about looking at the different answers and figuring out how everything can fit together to create one coherent narrative, one coherent argument about this subject supported by all of the available research. This is very similar to dialectics or Hegelian dialectics, and I've talked about dialectic argument in another video, but essentially the idea there is you have a thesis, one proposition about how the world works, and it meets an antithesis, a competing proposition about how the world works. Now the antithesis may not be the opposite of the thesis, it may just be a different interpretation or a different answer to a particular question. But the encounter of the thesis and the antithesis creates a synthesis, which is a new answer derived from presumably what's correct or what's most persuasive about the thesis and antithesis. And then that synthesis becomes a new thesis, which meets a new antithesis, producing new synthesis, and so on until all of the thoughts that can be thought have been thought. Pretty straightforward. But synthesis is essentially the same kind of thing, where you're looking at the answers that different research sources give about a particular topic. So how do you sort of navigate this? Well, I have a synthesis chart, and I'll put an image of it up on the screen here for you. But the synthesis chart basically asks you to look at different sources. I put three categories, columns for three sources, but you can do more than that. You could do, you can't do less than two, but you could do two or more sources. Bearing in mind that the more sources you try to synthesize in one go, the more complicated everything becomes. So three sources works really well for a fairly simple and straightforward synthesis. And basically what this chart asks you to do, the core portion of it, where the actual work of synthesis is being done, asks you to identify three topics that you want to discuss in the particular researched essay that you're working on. 3 points, main ideas, claims, whatever it is. And you don't necessarily have to have a stance on them at this point. Like that's totally legitimate. If you just say, I know I want to talk about X thing, Y thing, and Z thing, even if you don't know what you want to say. Totally fine for this stage. Because what you're going to do is, for each of these rows in the chart, you're going to write down what that source says about that topic. So what does source A say about topic 1? What does source B say about topic 1? What does source C say about topic 1? Same thing for topic 2, topic 3, whatever it is. And then you have a sort of visual chart where you can start comparing and contrasting. And the next stage that I have my students do is actually to identify one point that two or more sources agree on and one point that two or more sources disagree on. But if you're using this for your own research and you're using this as a way of taking research notes or of pre-writing, you want to probably do more than that. You want to identify as many points as possible that the sources agree on and disagree on so that you can start navigating through this and figuring out how you're going to combine the information from different sources to create not only a well-supported argument, but a nuanced argument that considers different perspectives or different arguments that are being made about this subject. Because this is one of the things, is synthesis isn't necessarily going to give you, here's one coherent answer. Synthesis is going to give you, here's one complex answer. And that complexity may and probably will include elements like disagreements between sources, alternative interpretations of evidence, competing versions describing what's going on in the world. And this is not a problem necessarily. This is the way that research works and the way that academia works, is we have all of these different voices and perspectives and ideas. And what we as writers and researchers and critical thinkers need to do is to assess these different perspectives to figure out what's the most reliable or accurate perspective. And synthesis is a really good way of approaching that because, again, we're getting different ideas, but we're also seeing where there's agreement and where there's disagreement. And this also, this can be beneficial because, again, this can also help us identify how reliable particular points are. If scholars, experts in the field broadly agree on something, it's probably pretty reliable. Whereas if there's a lot of disagreement about something, we need to be a little more careful about deciding what's true. And synthesis is a way of doing this. Using a chart like this or thinking about sources in comparison and contrast with other sources, finding points of agreement and points of disagreement, and thinking about how we can merge our sources into the best and best supported argument possible. This is all really, really useful research stuff.